Thanks everyone for actually tuning into the CD Foundation YouTube channel and watching us live. This is our workshop number first for 2024. And thank you very much for the community and the CD Foundation governing body to actually accepting me for the co-chair for the CD workshop as well. So today's topic is if you build it, they will come, enabling a vibrant open source community. And I'm really excited to inviting you, and we'll be presenting in a minute Neil McGonigal, Director of Cloud and Platform Engineering in Fidelity Investment. Thank you very much, Neil, for joining us today.
Yeah, delighted to be here, Sam. Delighted to be here. So hi everybody, you're very welcome. So my name is Neil McGonigal, and as Sam said there, I'm the Director of Cloud and Platform Engineering at Fidelity Investments. I'm also a sitting member of the CDF Technical Oversight Committee as well, which has been a great experience over the last year. It's really given me some useful insights into open source as well. And I suppose the key aspects of my role at Fidelity include driving engineering best practices and standards to ensure we have alignment across the engineering group. I've also been involved in the creation and application of our talent framework, which is used to define role expectation and to understand and measure associate performance. And I've also been involved in promoting and growing key strategic initiatives across the engineering group. And to that end, part of my role over the last 2 years has been to drive our open source initiative. And that covers not only the adoption of open source in our applications and our products and our platforms, but also building a vibrant contribution community within Fidelity. So that's the intros done. Let's kick off with a super exciting slide, which is actually my attempt at humor. It's not that exciting. It's just a disclaimer slide that this is just our experience and it's a story. It's not an endorsement or recommendation or anything like that. So today I'm going to talk about how we built a culture of open source adoption and contribution from zero, from the ground up. How do we go about that, and what challenges did we encounter, and what steps did we take to overcome those challenges? And I'll talk about our initial approach and strategy and how we generated engagement and partnership within the company to make our open source journey a success. So who's the target audience for this story? Basically, everyone and anyone who has an interest in helping to grow or support an open source community. So everyone's journey to open source will be different, but I'm hopeful that some of the learnings from our journey will help some other people with their journey. I mean, the more entry points we have into open source adoption and contribution by sharing journey stories, the more the ecosystem will benefit from that growth and diversity. So it's important to note up front, open source contribution can be challenging, and it isn't because companies like Fidelity don't want to participate in the community process. It's rather because there's a lot of upfront concern about consequences that may or may not be grounded in experience. Often the concerns are pretty abstract and they're not specific to a particular contribution or project. You can have things like security concerns. What if the project we contribute to gives away hints about our internal platforms? You can have reputational concern. What if we do something embarrassing? You can have practical or pragmatic concerns. What if we invest all this time in doing something and it goes nowhere? So in an industry like ours, the root of the concern is not that we're afraid of the tech. It's quite the opposite. Most fintech firms are highly sophisticated entities. So when you set out to build a vibrant open source community, it's so important to generate support at the outset through setting context on why this initiative is important and valuable. So take the time to create a strategy and plan out the steps, because open source adoption and open source contribution, they're not solely technical challenges as much as they are social challenges, because you will not be successful without developing a culture and a community to support it. And what sort of support am I talking about? They will need to be successful. I'm talking about engineering engagement, getting the engineers on board. I'm talking about OSPO, Open Source Program Office, getting them on board, getting their support. I'm talking about enterprise cybersecurity support, and I'm also talking about backing from leadership and engineering leaders as well. So I've just talked about how you're going to need to create the culture and the community and the support to be successful, because you can't build a community or drive an initiative if people don't understand and buy into why it's important. So you need to make sure you're really clear on the why. Why are we taking this journey to open source adoption? Why are we trying to build this vibrant contribution community? You know, what are the drivers for you or for your company? That's really important to have that at the beginning and understand what that is. So once you have a clear vision and a clear understanding of why you want to create an open source community, the next steps is to generate understanding and engagement and excitement and motivation to get involved. And you'll need to make this relevant to your audience, whether it's leadership or whether it's engineers. And there's multiple ways you can do this. So in Fidelity, we started with open source 101 sessions. We had an introduction and an overview of open source software, and we involved the Open Source Program Office, and we presented a number of informational sessions to engineers and to leaders on all things open source. And we set out, why was this a strategic initiative for Fidelity? We set the context and we told people why this was important and relevant to them. And the approach we took was to set the context in two ways. And I'll just talk a bit about those two different branches of setting that context. The first was around value for the firm. You'll probably be familiar with some of these, but I'm going to call out some of the high level kind of points around when we talk about value for the firm. What does that mean? Why is this important to the firm? Things like cost efficiency. So open source software will often eliminate the need for license fees, software license fees, and that will reduce operational costs. And obviously, if you can leverage open source tools and libraries, it's going to save you, not just cost, but also time. And speaking about time as well, faster development is another reason why this is important to the firm. The open source components and libraries that we can use that are pre-built and pre-tested, that really allows you to focus more on your core products and features, and it speeds up time to market, and ultimately you can release customer value at a faster pace. I think another really important point of why this is valuable for the company would be around community collaboration. So engaging with the open source projects and that community really allows you to tap into a global community of developers. And it's a very collaborative environment. Open source often fosters innovation, so you can accelerate bug fixes as well through the open source community. And it obviously enhances the quality of the software too. Talent attraction and retention is another point, and as a hiring manager at Fidelity, I can really speak to the importance of this one, because when a company is actively involved in open source projects, it really makes it more attractive to top tier developers, because they recognize that opportunity to work, broaden their scope essentially and work outside the box in a much larger innovation rich environment too. Another reason would be around strategic influence. If we're going to leverage open source projects and tools and components, we should be involved in the community so we can influence the direction of the technology that we rely on. That's a really important one as well. And from there, you can develop fruitful partnerships and collaborations within the open source ecosystem too. I would say then probably things like the flexibility around customization, the fact that you can use open source in a way that fits your business needs, and you can contribute to make sure that it's a very bespoke solution for you, is often can give you a competitive advantage over using an off-the-shelf product or an in-house developed product as well. There's more flexibility there. Long-term viability is probably another point I'd mention as well. Because the open source projects aren't tied to the fate of a specific company, it ensures that the software investment you make there can remain viable in the longer term too. So there's definitely a lot of talking points there around the value for the firm. But that's only one branch of setting the context. The other was around the value for the engineer. And this was really important because we wanted to build a very convincing case of why this open source initiative is really valuable and relevant to the engineers themselves. I mean, it's great to talk about the value for the firm, but ultimately the engineers are the community. So some of the key messaging here was around opportunity. And a lot of obvious ones here, but some of the high points would be skills development, exposure to diverse technology. So obviously contributing to open source projects really allows developers to hone their craft by working on various real world code bases and collaborating with a really diverse group of experienced developers. And that hands-on experience undoubtedly accelerates their skills growth and helps them to become better developers. I would say as well, just broadening their experience as well. When you think about learning best practices, a lot of best practices evolve within the very innovative space of open source as well. So being plugged into that as well allows developers to learn things from the broader community and bring them back in-house, which is a huge advantage for, again, the development opportunities for the engineer. And that could be everything from not just best practices, but getting code review experience that they might not get the opportunity in-house is important as well. That's one I actually noticed was oftentimes engineers would want to work on something that the current backlog didn't really give them that stretch opportunity. But looking into the open source community, they could get involved in projects that are beyond kind of their own backlog work, which gives them, as I said, broader scope. I would say as well, a couple of others would be just around growing their network. So meeting engineers with different experiences and backgrounds and making, developing partnerships with different mentors. Again, a lot of development opportunity for engineers for their professional growth by getting involved in open source. And then, of course, the final one I'd mention would be around contributing to the common good. You know, I've made some contributions myself, and there's a really gratifying feeling of giving something back to the broader community and knowing that what you contribute is out there being used by others as well. So to have that opportunity in a company is a fantastic motivator for engineers, I would say as well. We're very fortunate actually in Fidelity. We have a dedicated learning day, 1 day per week, which is set aside from backlog work. And it's really there for allowing engineers to, you know, pursue certifications or get involved in different projects or really think outside the box and get away from the backlog so they can, you know, get involved in different things and bring fresh ideas back. And open source was a really, I guess, golden opportunity to get involved in on learning days to actually go and pursue something within open source. So what we actually did was we set up some learning day sessions on our learning day. And we had people guide engineers through the contribution process, everything from finding their first issue right the way through to creating an external PR for their first contribution. There was also probably an associate performance element to a lesser extent. So I mentioned our talent framework in my opening slide. The development and the professional growth opportunities for engineers I've mentioned already speak for themselves. But there's also an opportunity to show impact and influence within their role by being an active participant and really helping to grow this community around this important strategic initiative. And we made sure that we recognize the advocates and the champions and the early adopters who, you know, did their first or demonstrated their commitment to open source or completed the early contributions as part of this initiative. And to that end, we had created custom open source contributor NFT badges that were displayed on engineers' internal company profiles. And those were awarded for, you know, people got a green badge, for example, for their first contribution. They got a bronze badge for 5 contributions. And recognition efforts like that are really important. And they really do matter to the overall success of an initiative like this, as well as creating a positive experience for the engineers too, I would say. So yeah, so that was the two branches that we set context around: value for the firm, value for the engineer. And they were kind of two different messaging, but very supportive of each other as we started to stand this initiative up. It's really important to have a strategy. So having a clear vision underpinned by a plan, will help garner support from leadership and other interested partners that you're going to need to be successful. People I mentioned earlier, you're going to need the engineers, open source program office, enterprise cybersecurity, all the way up the chain to leadership. And there will be questions. And if you have a strategy, it will help build confidence and credibility in the initiative. And it will also help you to visualize the steps yourself along your own journey. So you have to walk before you can run, or in our case, you have to crawl before you can walk, because as I said, we were starting at the absolute bottom. And the beginning for us was all about enablement. We wanted to prove out the contribution process, and we wanted to identify bottlenecks or friction in the contribution process. We wanted to learn about how to do this properly. We wanted to refine the process. And we also wanted to get feedback from the engineers who made those initial contributions. And we listened and we asked them questions. We asked them what works, what worked, what was good, what was positive for the experience. We also obviously asked them what was frustrating, what was time consuming. And the contributions themselves at this enablement phase were from a wide array of projects. And any small contribution was good enough, because the primary goal here was just to enable and to learn and to familiarize engineers with the contribution process and the initiative. So as I said, we started at zero. So those initial enablement sessions that we ran in the early days, they helped us to identify a few key open source champions, perhaps some engineers who'd already made contributions to open source, maybe external to the firm. And we leveraged those champions to help establish the community. And we made sure that they understood the messaging around why. Why are we doing this? Why is it important to the firm? Why is it important to the engineers themselves? And those initial champions became a key part of our beginning plans to scale and to teach and to support others in those learning sessions. So let me flip back to the strategy for a second. We had a really simple approach, 3 pillars, and we wanted to begin with enablement, which was all about teaching engineers about the initiative and the contribution process via simple nano contributions. Next, we wanted to develop expertise in particular projects that would provide benefit for the firm. And we had multiple engineers working on contributions with the same projects, within the same projects in that particular phase. And we call that project clusters. And that really allowed us to contribute more complicated, complex code changes and features, because we were working in groups. And finally, we wanted the open source initiative to have positive and measurable impact within both the firm and within the open source ecosystem. Ultimately, building our reputation and credibility to a position where we could basically engage and develop partnerships and collaborate with strategically important open source projects. So throughout this strategy, throughout this journey, we leveraged many different means to promote and grow our engagement across our engineering group with the open source initiative. And the end goal was always about building the culture and the community. So we used workshops, we used learning sessions, I mentioned. We had one-to-one coaching sessions where champions would coach new people all about open source and take them along the process. We had jams and mini jams, and I'll talk a little bit more about jams later on in the deck. We had internal conferences to help promote the initiative as well. And we also identified and supported those champions I talked about, and we leveraged their experience to help deliver sessions. We also used focus groups as well to identify strategic open source opportunities within particular platforms and products. So just to provide a little bit more context on the first pillar in the strategy and the nano contributions. So these are all about enablement and creating familiarization with the contribution process. So we targeted these kind of contributions in our initial workshop sessions so that people could learn the process without too much complexity. For example, most of our nano contributions were document changes or minor bug fix issues. Any open source project was fine too, because at that point, we weren't targeting specific strategic projects. This was really just about getting people involved having fun, learning, and building the community initially. So success measurement is going to change over time depending on where you are in your journey. And initially, for the enablement pillar of our strategy, we were focused on growing the number of contributors and the number of contributions. That was the one metric that we cared about at that early first stage in the strategy, building the muscle essentially, enabling a culture and a community of engineers who were now familiar with the process and had, made at least their first nano contribution. So as things started to move in a positive direction, and as the community started to grow, how do we keep it all manageable? It was definitely difficult. It wasn't an easy ask at all. We had to really think about how to structure things in a way that would allow us to scale efficiently as we graduated from the nano contribution and enablement phase into the more strategically important project cluster stage and beyond. So we created an open source steering group to provide the structure and the oversight and transparency for all the community. And we invited representation from the open source program office, from enterprise cybersecurity, from our open source focus groups I mentioned, and also from our engineering community. Those champions and key advocates were invited along too. And to provide transparency as well, we shared our steering group minutes as GitHub issues so that anyone in the firm could review or amend the agenda, or they could see the content of the discussions and the action outs we agreed from steering group meetings. And having that representation, that broad representation across the initiative, participate in the steering group, it really did allow us to surface up and to address any challenges as they arose, and also to float ideas and suggest changes to improve the strategy in real time. The steering group was configured as a federated model where we created and empowered various platforms and product-specific focus groups to meet and work independently. And then those focus groups could work on identifying the strategic contribution opportunities within their own spaces. And then they would bring representation to the steering group meeting where they could provide updates on what was happening in open source in their particular platform area, or they could get support with challenges too. And the steering group was also the main source of information for the community on the upcoming events that we were organizing, or for people to get support in general with all things open source or anything to do with the initiative. So project clusters, this was the second pillar I showed in the strategy there. Once we progressed from the first strategic pillar of enablement to the point where we had a burgeoning community of tens of contributors, we then wanted to focus on developing expertise in particular project areas of relevance, especially to our focus groups, relevant to our platforms. So it was all about identifying and focusing on projects of strategic value to the firm and identifying more complex contribution opportunities. So we organized and worked in clusters of engineers to deliver complex code changes and feature contributions to specific projects. And an example of two strategically important projects for us where we initially set up clusters would be CD Events, which is a CDF incubated project, and also OpenTelemetry. Project clusters was all about progressing from the arbitrary learning and enablement nano contribution and now focusing on projects and contributions with measurable strategic impact for our platforms. So this, it's not deja vu. This is another measuring success slide. We only had one a couple of slides back, because I want to make a point here. I mentioned that our measurement metric of interest would change as we progressed on our journey. And at the project cluster stage, this measurement now looks different than it did at the enablement stage. We still care about growing the community, absolutely. But at this point, the focus was on describing the impact and the value of the initiative. And this meant focusing on the number of strategic contributions and the ratio actually of non-strategic to strategic contributions. And strategic contributions are those with measurable impact and value in our platforms and our applications. So we were less concerned now about the number of contributions, rather we were interested in the substance and the content of the contributions, the context, if you like, the value and the strategic impact at this point was what we were really focusing in on. As I said already, it's not plain sailing. It definitely is not. There is definitely challenges when you try and set something up at scale like this. I suppose that we did face challenges, nothing that we couldn't overcome, but I would say probably the main challenge for us was to create alignment and intent and agreement on the contribution process across the interested parties. So again, think about the Open Source Program Office. They have a particular lens on open source, and it might be around, licensing or whatever else. They have their lens. Enterprise cybersecurity will have a particular lens on open source and what it means to them. And the engineering community, I would say even, have a particular lens too. So we needed to hear all the concerns from the interested parties, and we really had to try and do our best to satisfy those concerns holistically. So we wanted to do this obviously as securely as possible, but we also wanted to automate and remove as much friction as we could from the process too. We also wanted to build in traceability, so we'd have that transparency, and so we could understand things like lead time and other metrics that might be of value for us. So bringing all of that together and taking input from all the different, interested parties, that was definitely the biggest challenge. I would say a second challenge was probably around maintaining momentum. So coming up with new ways every couple of weeks, every month, or even every quarter to renew and reinvent and reinvigorate and think of original and fresh ideas to promote and continue to generate positive engagement within the community. So that it didn't just die out on the vine. We wanted to keep this relevant and keep it chugging along. That was definitely a challenge too. And when you stand up a community like this, that's probably something to think about as well, is how do we keep this moving along? What sort of things we need to put in place to keep it engaging? And one of the ways that we tackled that challenge of keeping the momentum was looking at jams and mini jam opportunities on our learning days. I said I'd explain a bit about what these were. So focus groups would help identify an area we can jam on. So think about engineers who don't work together normally swarming on a particular problem. So we would call that the jam. And that was what we would do is the focus group would set out the context and the goal of what the jam was. And we'd send invites to the community and boom, learning for all in a group setting. And we were getting bigger contributions done by using the jams through crowd power. And it was really effective. It was a really fun community building and learning event. And we hold regular jams now in various strategically important spaces, and we'll definitely continue to do so. And that keeps it fresh because the content or the subject matter for the jam changes, and it can be different. And depending on what you're going after, you can really generate a lot of interest and keep that engagement happening as well. So we've contributed to, I think, over 70 different open source projects as it stands today. We've almost 100 contributors, and we've hundreds of contributions across a wide array of projects there. Some of the big names are on the screen there, you'll recognize. And we're continuing to expand our engagement with the open source community and also our commitment to open source through continuing to drive this initiative, engage with the community too. Currently, right now, one of our most recent ongoing efforts is the security jam. So I mentioned we focus on different types of jams. So we've started to look for security vulnerabilities in some of the projects that we leverage and contribute to. And these could be really simple things like outdated versions of libraries, or also potentially more complex changes too. So we'd get together a jam on a learning day, as I said, and we'd basically identify and contribute security updates back into various projects. And this has been a really fantastic learning and community building opportunity for engineers, as well as having a positive impact for our own platforms, as well as for the open source ecosystem. I suppose thinking into the future a bit, the next phase of our strategy is probably to look at even more strategic partnership opportunities with some of the projects that we currently contribute to. So providing engineering expertise or proposing new features or helping to innovate and grow and sustain more open source projects. So if I could leave you probably with 3 key takeaways that are critical in building an open source community, I think they would be, the first one would be to talk about the context from the outset. You really can't do that enough. You've got to talk enthusiastically and passionately about why this is such an important initiative. And you have to talk with everyone who listen, and probably talk to those who won't listen too. Actually, talk to the people who don't want to listen first. Really, if you talk about this with passion and really explain it, it'll trickle out there through the engineers, and people will really get on board. And that's super important, because if people have that story and the context and they recognize the passion and the drive behind it, you're off to the correct start there for getting this up and running. I suppose the second one I would say would be to engage at the outset with those interested and involved parties. So the people you're going to need to be successful. I've mentioned the Open Source Program Office. I've mentioned ECS, Enterprise Cybersecurity. I've mentioned key engineering leaders. If you get those guys on board at the beginning, again, you're off to a really good start, because you'll build key relationships that further down the road you're going to need to be successful with this initiative. And I would say a third point, which is super important, and I kind of alluded to it earlier in the deck, you really have to recognize those advocates and champions who help move the dial with the initiative. So those engineers and leaders who are your key promoters, they're the ones who are going to make this happen. So you have to let them know how valued their time and contribution to the initiative is. So empower them, call them out, support them. They're key, absolutely. So that's it, folks. I really hope you found some of that interesting, and hopefully you took away something of value from the session. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn and connect. I'm definitely happy to engage with anyone who's on a similar journey and offer any insights I can. And at this point, I think we'll go back to same, and maybe we can take some Q&A for a while.
Yes, thanks for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed a lot, learns bunch of new stuff, listening all the way. And hope that's the same experience for the attendees as well. And I do notice we have some questions from the Mark, and some are very good question in there. So number one question, were there specific techniques that you needed to take in order to prevent inadvertent escape of sensitive information?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a primary concern. And, I mentioned a couple of times in the deck and the presentation there that people's journey to open source will be different, because it's very unique how companies handle that particular element of escape data, what security they put in place. We obviously built our own approach to that, where we would make changes internally first on mirrors of public repos, and then we would actually get them, approved by the Open Source Program Office and by Enterprise Cybersecurity. And then when we were comfortable that they were, good contributions to leave the company, then they would actually move out. So technically how that's configured will be different for each company, but you're absolutely right that large firms, that are concerned, obviously, as most large firms should be, about sensitive data escape, will have something in place like this where they can enable open source contribution, but in a way that is controlled, in the sense that it's not, the Wild West where anyone can contribute to any project, where you will do it in a very managed way internally. And to be honest, that's part of the whole approach around identifying strategic focus areas that a company might want to focus on. Having that kind of loop in there and bringing people along that journey is all part of managing how we contribute.
Yes, absolutely. I think this question is kind of really interesting these days because of the advent of LLM and generative AI. So people actually start educating their LLM model, and we make sure that there's no sensitive information in there as well. Uh, Question number two from Mark. Were there regulatory concern that needed to be addressed as part of contribution to open source projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was mainly handled by the Open Source Program Office, I would say. So the Open Source Program Office would have a relationship with legal within the company. They would understand all of the different types of licensing. If you're familiar with open source, you'll know it's not straightforward that there's one license. There's all different types of licensing involved in open source, and each project can vary. So that regulation was handled by the Open Source Program Office. And how we set it up was they would, look into certain projects that someone wanted to contribute to, and they would maybe talk to legal if required. And once we had a green light on that project, then it was approved, if you like, so anyone could go and contribute to that project. If someone wanted to make a contribution to a project that we hadn't previously made a contribution to, there'd be that initial phase again of looking at the project, its licensing, and everything else. But as I said, we've over 70 projects now that are mirrored internally, where we've gone through that process and they've been greenlit as, we're comfortable from a regulation standpoint on contributing to these particular projects. But they're, as I said, that would be handled by the Open Source Program Office and legal primarily.
Thanks for answering, Neil. Question number three from Mark. Are you using any specific measurement to decide if your efforts are working to increase open source contributions?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the measurement phase has changed since the beginning of the journey. Where we want to get to is to have impactful value within our platforms. So that means that our platforms are more secure, easier to maintain, and that we can use them to release value quicker to the customer and in a cost-effective way. So there's various metrics we can use to understand what that looks like, and we are invested in defining measurement that will give us that information we need to understand. Are we removing frictions from the process, and are we actually making impactful, valuable contributions that allow us to release value quicker to the customer? So that would vary based on project to project, but it is something we're closely looking at. I would say a final point on that is when we started the initiative, it was more around building that community, and the measurement then was very simple. It was about the number of contributors, and are we developing that muscle within the company that people have done a contribution and understand how to do it. Now it's much more around what's the value, how do we define what that value is within this platform, that maybe we rebuild it by using a non-licensed removing a license fee product or vendor and inserting open source. What does that value look like? And be able to define that. That's going to be important for where we go right now into the next phase of expanding our footprint within open source.
Yes, and I hope, Mark, this answers your question. And if not, do tell us in the chat as well. And your final question for Neil today: when one group saw a project as strategic, but other groups didn't see it as strategic, how did you resolve disagreement between groups as they were trying to identify the strategic open source projects? A very good one, Mark.
Wow, lads, these are fantastic questions. I'm very familiar with the content of the question, so maybe it shows that people are actually clued in and listening, because these questions are spot on. That is something that's not black and white. It's a gray area. And what is a strategic contribution? It's very easy to say anything that we use as part of our platforms, well, that's strategic. We use it, easy. Anything that we depend on as part of our platforms, that's strategic too. But there's other ones then which might be more gray areas, where someone would have to make a case around how is this strategically important to us. You could have a very low bar and say, well, it's going to enable our engineers to learn about this, and ultimately that's going to have a strategic dividend. You could say that, but we were more focused on actually, looking at projects that we could more clearly say, this is strategically important. We're either planning to move to this particular open source project as part of one of our platforms, or it's related in some way to something we're building. So we would make a case like that. But again, that's something that will be different for each company, but it's a really important thing to do up front, because if you just open it up, you will have a lot of people pick, I can't even tell you how many open source projects there are, but there's an awful lot. So you'll have people pick, things that take their fancy, and that's initially fine for a nano contribution or just engaging. But once we get by that initial stage, you will want to be able to impart to the community what strategic means, and actually encourage your engineers to look for opportunities that will bring value back into the firm. So again, it'll be a bit different for each company how they do that, but it's very important to have that definition, while also not putting people off. You don't want to say, no, you can't do this, this, and this, you can only do that. But you want to encourage them to say, these projects and this direction is definitely strategically important for us, and you can encourage people to put their lens on particular projects.
Thanks, Mark. And I think the one more question for the Mark. Are company contributions to open source more commonly in certain areas than others? Is there anything that offers should considered based on those areas and how they relate to Fidelity's need?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's similar to around the strategically important contributions. I think, personally speaking, any contribution an engineer makes to open source is a positive one. It's going to benefit them, the whole experience of it, engagement with the community. That's number one. So I've never had an engineer come back and say, oh, that wasn't a good experience, or that wasn't time well spent. So you'll always have a good experience, whichever project you want to contribute to. However, it is important for the company to encourage and direct people towards certain projects that will benefit different platforms we have. So what we do is, as part of the community, we encourage people to look at the focus group that's in their particular area. I'll give you an example. One of the focus groups we have is around eventing, around our eventing strategy, things like messaging queues and data and streams, all that area. And there's a lot of open source opportunity within eventing. Another platform area for us would be application lifecycle management. And again, there's a lot of opportunity within that space as it relates to open source, not just Jenkins Core, but a lot of other tooling, CD events I mentioned as well, a lot of opportunity. So I would encourage engineers, if you're going to look at this on your learning day, or you want to do something that benefits the firm, but also your own development, get engaged with a focus group that you think is maybe most relevant or interesting to your work. And then once you're in that focus group, then you can kind of talk to people working within that space around what sort of projects are we interested in contributing to, for example, in eventing or in application lifecycle management. So that can really give you a good insight into, where you should be investigating. And obviously, if a company doesn't have that set up yet, I would encourage them to, advocate some key champions, engineers who have some experience in open source and understand their platforms, and have them set up a focus group, and then you can help people and guide them towards specific contributions and projects that way too. You're on mute.
Oh. Well, thanks you very much, Neil, for answering all these wonderful questions from the Mark. And thanks for asking, Mark. It's been some great questions to actually consider for this workshop. And also, as you mentioned, I think the special interesting groups, as you call out during, I think in the foundation, we have all these group like special interest group within the CNCF, within the CD Foundation. I think this is the setup is really important for the companies who are looking forward to the contributing as well. But it's been a pleasure learning from you. It's been great excitement, but I definitely hand over to Roxanne because he has some last things to cover today.
I have a question actually, Neil. I was wondering, how long did it take to get here? Because now Fidelity is so involved, right? I mean, you won 2 awards at the CDF. And so how long did it take, and when do you get involved in foundations and on boards, and when do you start presenting at conferences, and how do you decide who you send to conferences and all that stuff?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's never too early to send people to conferences, I would say, even if they just have the initial steps and they don't have a lot of experience yet, and they think, well, maybe we're not qualified to talk about the open source journey. there's a lot of other people in the same boat who'd love to hear how you're going about getting started and everything else. So I would say it's never too early to get involved in talking about your experience. It'll actually help your journey as well, the more you talk to others about it. So on that point, that's what I'd say there. With regards how long it took to get things going, I think, companies can try and do this stuff without the proper backing in place initially, and then it can become an uphill struggle. So I did mention a couple of times in my deck there, getting key people on board at the beginning of the initiative, engineering leadership, the open source program office, enterprise cybersecurity, and having some key relationships initially. If you start at that point, you can build momentum quite quickly. You can put together some sessions, you can promote them internally. And if you get someone who's passionate about open source and has some experience and can talk to it, it's amazing that engineers will want to get involved and spend some time looking into this. So it can happen quite quickly. I'd say for us, we probably spent 6 months to a year, which sounds like a long time, but that was starting at the beginning and building up that initial community around enablement and nano contributions, and during that process then identifying different focus groups and identifying champions who could help with the focus groups, and then setting up a steering group, and then internal conferences talking about why we want to do this. So all of that stuff, I would say 6 months to a year, but it can happen very quickly once you have the initiative that's backed by the open source program office, leadership, and cybersecurity. Once that's in place, I think there's not many obstructions around why it would take a long time. You can really press ahead with it then. Great questions. If you gotta ask me what kind of questions would you like to get today, I'd be thinking just anything relevant that I have something that I can comment on. But these have all been really to the point, which is fantastic. Obviously, this is a subject that resonates with people on the call because really on point questions.
Over to you, Roxanne, or if you want to wrap up, or I try to wrap.
You can wrap up.
Oh, thanks, Roxanne. So once again, Nate, it's been a great, I think it's a very critical topic these days, and the way you phrases the presentation, it's been really very well resonating with the audience as well. That's why we're able to see some wonderful questions in the chat as well. And thank you very much for taking the time and answering those questions as well. Once again, it's a precise, descriptive, short, but it's a very focused conversation from the Neil. I hope everyone enjoyed that conversation as well. So with that, we look forward for the next version as well. And the proposal is open on the CD Foundation workshop URL. And we're looking forward to hearing folks what they wanted to cover next. Fill out a form, and Roxanne or me will connect with you, and we'll be making sure all the things will be planned accordingly, and you will be presenting next. But we will be meeting soon for the next workshop. And till then, Roxanne, Neil, have a wonderful day, and thanks for taking the time out for sharing your stuff with the community.
Thanks, guys.